Thank you, Chris, for those very kind words. I hope everybody can hear me, just gesticulate if you can't. Well, I'm very happy to be here in Dublin tonight to speak to you all about my recent research, and very honoured to receive this award in the name of Alice, Effie as she was called in the family, Murray. I have an affinity with Alice Murray because I went to Cambridge as well as she did, but I went several generations later and to the rival women's college. And being a hard-working person, I left with a degree, whereas poor old Alice, who was probably equally industrious, left empty-handed because, of course, as Chris told us, Cambridge did not give women degrees until 1948. That didn't stop Alice. She headed off to LSE, where she worked under the supervision of Lillian Knowles, the indomitable Lillian Knowles, and she produced a PhD, as we've heard, on Anglo-Irish commercial relations. And this was turned into a book, which is a classic book. However, 3 months after she got the doctorate, Alice married. And like then most women of her class and her time, she withdrew not only from academic life, but from the labour market. She spent the rest of her life caring for her children and supporting her husband. And it's this kind of women's work that I want to talk to you about tonight, the caring and support work. We're going further back in time than Alice, I'm happy to say. You might find that more difficult. But we're going further back in time than her time period. Okay, so on the night of the 27th of March, 1730, one Richard Rhodes banged on the door of a Peter Walkden, a farmer and nonconformist minister in sparsely populated northeast Lancashire. The reason Rhodes was waking the pastor this late at night was that another neighbour, a man called Robert Seed, was ill and needed help with advice on physic, as he put it, and some comfort. But the neighbour was not seeking to wake Walkden himself. He was in search of Catherine Walkden, the wife of Peter Walkden, who got out of bed and went with the neighbour to the bedside of the invalid. We don't know if Peter Walkden himself went back to bed or sat up waiting for her, but she returned about an hour later, and they both then lay down in bed and slept comfortably, quote, unquote, till morning. We know about Catherine Walkden's neighbourly act of caring and kindness because Peter Walkden had a lifetime addiction to writing diaries. And this is a page from one of his diaries. Why should we even care whether we know about her caring labour? Well, the answer is that caring labour is in fact essential for human well-being. It's essential for the reproduction of the economy. It's neglected by economists and, shameful to say, by economic historians, whether it's paid or whether it's unpaid. And if it's unpaid, it's actually completely ignored. And this is a real problem because it can move back and forth across what economists call the production boundary. So sometimes it can be paid, sometimes it can be unpaid, unrewarded. And therefore, sometimes it's counted in GDP or in our historical measures of GDP, and sometimes it's not. And if there are, in fact, significant movements of particular kinds of care work across that border, this means that we are measuring rates of change in economic well-being and economic, even within GDP, incorrectly. Caring labour is a problem to actually get a hold of because it's very diverse. Very many different tasks comprise this work. It's also historically specific. It varies over time as to what people do to care for other people. It's class contingent. We're not going to really be talking about the kinds of work that Alice Effie Murray did, because she was a member of the elite, very upper strata of the middle class. We're going to be talking about the kinds of caring work that Catherine Walkden did. Many economists say we don't bother to count caring labour because we don't know what time is spent on it, and therefore how can we measure it? There is a problem with lack of evidence on time use. But of course, if we were cynical, we might say one reason we don't bother to measure caring labour is by and large it's done by women. And so it drops out of the lens, the worldview of economists and economic historians. And this is a quote from my colleague, Eva Rosenhaft, who says, women disappear from history unless we're looking directly at them. And one of my theses tonight is that we rarely look directly at women when they are caring. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is I'm going to construct a working woman's day. So I'm responding to those claims that, oh, we don't know what time was spent doing caring work. And I'm going to include both paid and unpaid labour. And I'm going to identify caring work within this repertoire of tasks. And then I'm going to infer the value of that labour time from market equivalence. And this, by the way, is a very standard approach to unpaid service provision. I have no idea why this approach, which is widely used, for instance, to measure services from household property, from housing, but this so obviously can be used to measure unpaid work in the home. Then I'm going to aggregate across all households, relate the totals to GDP measures, and show you how important, how sizable, how quantitatively important this work was, and compare it with other historical estimates. So, what we're going to do is we're going to shadow Catherine Walkden. And by the way, she appears on almost every page of Walkden's diaries. But he never refers to her as Catherine. He always refers to her as my love. My love did this. My love did that. But we can follow her through the diaries. And we have two lots of diaries. The first diaries come from 1725, 1729, and 1730. And they were excerpted by a guy called Dobson and published in the Athenian and later on in a very small and very hard to get a hold of book. But Dobson just took extracts from the diaries, and we don't know how what he chose to extract and what he left out. And the originals have alas not survived. So we only have Dobson's extracts from these years. This is the diary from the 1730s, 1733, and that is a complete diary. And fortunately for me, because you saw that crabbed handwriting on the earlier slide, fortunately for me, it was in fact transcribed completely by Chipping Local History Society, but you can check the original, which is in Chester Record Office. Walkden, as I've said, was a nonconformist minister and farmer, living in a little village called Thornley in a sparsely populated part of Lancashire. But his diaries they're not diaries as we might think of them today, with reflecting on his spiritual journey or, his sensibilities or his religious beliefs. They are, in fact, an account of his farming routine and the activities of his family and many of his neighbours and his interactions with this social group. It's a large, today, what we would call a blended family. Walkden had been married before. He had 3 children by his previous wife, who had died having the 3rd child, Margaret. He then waited several years and married my love. And he has several children with her, including a baby born in 1729, unfortunately for a time period when we don't have a diary. So he has these blended children living in the household. It's a large household, 5+ people. It also includes people who come and lodge overnight. And this is a very, very common occurrence. People who came to work for Walkden eat there and stay there overnight. Their wage is not only a cash wage, it includes all the perquisites that go along with meals and with staying overnight, creating, of course, further domestic demands. And many of the other nonconformist ministers, you probably know this, they go on tours to each other's chapels. So very frequently there's another minister coming through who stays in the Walkden household, stays overnight, requires feeding and domestic support. There is no domestic help in this household. Methodology. Gender historians have really struggled because it's very difficult to obtain signs of women's work from occupational titles. Women didn't really have occupations in the past like men did. They very often did seasonal work, part-time work. They did some jobs one year, other jobs another year, fitting them round their family obligations and so on. So they're not really describable as a carpenter, a builder, even an agricultural labourer. So occupational titles are very, very inadequate accounts of work for women. So what people have done is they've gone on a search for what is known in this literature as doing words, verbs which have female subjects. And this strategy, used to identify women's work, is pioneered by Barbara Hannawald, not really noticed much at the time, but in a very nice book in the 1980s, and then developed by Sheila Ogilvie, and very, on a wider scale, by Maria Agren at the University of Uppsala with a very large research project. And Maria Agren's done incredible work systematizing this approach to women's work. And most recently by Jane Whittle and Mark Halewood have used this technique on English data. But this technique has always been applied to court records. And that's a problem for me. Court records never really pick up women doing caring work. They are looking straight at women, but it's because women have been naughty or wicked, or they've seen somebody doing something naughty. And it's very unusual to be in that situation when you are wiping a baby's bottom or, cooking the dinner. So court records, I would argue, are a problematic source for picking up caring labour. But the verb-oriented approach to women's work produces some really rather surprising findings. One finding is that women are doing a lot more, a wider repertoire of tasks than is conventionally expected. And actually, also very interestingly, they're often directing other people. So they're not doing the work themselves, they're causing it to be done. So we also have to look for this kind of managerial role for women in the past. But also, Agren, and to a greater extent, Whittle and Halewood, found that there was much less caring work, particularly unpaid caring work in the family, revealed by this doing word approach. Now, of course, I would argue that this goes back to the fact that this methodology is being used specifically on court records. But Okay, so I'm going to also use verbs as my approach to women's work, but I'm not going to apply them to the court records, as you might expect, and I'm going to, in fact, use this approach to challenge those earlier findings, to question those findings about the repertoire of tasks that women do, and in fact, the surprising findings from this analysis. And I'm going to develop the methodology of doing words by adding evidence of ownership of tools and equipment and the purchase of raw materials and so on. Now, this is not a new thing. I haven't just got this crazy idea out of my own head. This has been very widely used to look at occupations in the past. People have looked at probate records and used the accounts of what tools were available in particular probates to look at the structure of the labor force in the past, going back centuries. You can do this. Similarly, evidence of production for sale is also evidence of activities done in the household. And I'm also going to look for evidence of the necessity for substitute labor when a principal worker is unable to do the usual tasks. So they might be laid up or they might be away. So then we would look and see if, in fact, substitute labor is being used. And I'm going to apply this extended version of the verb-orientated approach to alternative sources. And you've probably guessed the alternative sources are going to be Walkden's diaries. And I'm also going to infer the duration of tasks from within the source, plus from other contemporary or modern accounts. And there's some fun stuff here, because you can go online and you can go and look at some very strange American families who go back and kind of try and relive the original pioneer experience. So, you know, you can kind of go to homefarm.com and you can join in with a rather jolly lady who makes butter and cheese in her kitchen, you know, using some old-fashioned equipment, and allows her children to, you know, stick their heads in the buckets and so on. So you can actually follow up how long some of these tasks took. You can also spend a happy hour on the Oxfordshire Beekeeping Association's website, you know, which will tell you how long it takes to manage beehives and so on. So lots of, I also think I might engage my grandsons in doing some butter making at some point, but you know, it's a rather messy job, so has to wait for the right time. All right, so since this methodology involves doing words, plus ownership, plus production, plus substitutes, I'm going to call it the DOPS approach. Okay, so obviously, this is rather a labor-intensive task, and I'm not going to force you all to trot through all these diaries, because we'd be here for several days, let alone hours. So what we're going to do is just look at some examples here. So this is the very important example of milking and butter production, which are significant mainstays of Walkden's household and family. He doesn't make much money from being a nonconformist minister. He mainly makes the money from the farming. And the farming, a big part of the farming is the dairy. So in the 1920s diaries, in the 1720s diaries, there are no direct references, there are a few direct references to Catherine milking. But in the 1733 full transcription, she is announced to be milking almost every day. So there's a very interesting initial finding here, because this means Dobson dropped out those accounts of her milking. So already we're seeing how the sources discard evidence of women's work. But so in the complete transcription, she milks every day. Men never milk. When he goes to visit another minister, he always says, "Their women milked while I waited for my dinner," and things like this. Of course, she also possessed a lot of equipment that are associated with the dairy, particularly the purchase of cows and She's very heavily involved in this. It's not just left to Walkden. She accompanies Walkden to choose the cows, to look and see whether they're the appropriate cows, whether they look healthy, whether they look like they'll produce good milk. And we also see evidence of consumption of the products. Cormac told me last night that cheese was produced widely from Irish dairies. I'm suspicious that they are producing some cheese, but I can't find evidence of that. But lots of evidence of butter production. And some very nice evidence of the fact that when Catherine is not available, they have to hire replacement labor. So this is my little sign for substitute labor being needed. And so Walkden says in his diary, when Catherine lay in of daughter Catherine, this is when she was recovering from having the baby, they hired 2 local women, and he says, they helped us milk, wash, and the rest. Okay, well, we see in a minute what the rest might involve. All right, so then we take this account of labour time, and we try and scale it in terms of this account of jobs. We're trying to add duration of the time taken now to each of these jobs. And so you can see here we've got milking for cows. How long does that take? This is actually using both contemporary accounts of how long it takes to milk a cow and these rather strange things on the internet about this is how long it takes to hand milk a cow, and then you can accompany that same jolly lady and see her milking her cow by hand. And the same goes for butter production. Butter sales, we can follow Catherine, we can follow my love into Preston and find her selling her butter to a Madame Siddle very regularly. And when she doesn't go, it's still acknowledged that it's Catherine's product. So he will still say, we took her butter into Preston and sold it. She also sells it locally as well. She bakes bread. She bakes it herself. I've assumed that she only bakes once a week, but she bakes one taken from Cobbett. She would, in three and a half hours, she would be able to bake enough for a large family. She preserves. I know she buys Aliger, which is a kind of sour ale that she used to preserve. They've also got orchards, trees that got apples. She goes collecting stuff that she's then processing. Housework I've counted as 30 minutes daily. That's estimated mainly from the text and context. Childcare, I've estimated that as in 1 hour, and that is mainly estimated from when Walkden himself has to do it. More on that in a minute. She has the baby in 1729, so at some point she's breastfeeding. She's breastfeeding probably right through 29 and in the 1733 to 34 diary. Washing the clothes, this is also a task that they require when she's laid up, so it's a serious task in the household. She's better at accounting than Walkden himself. So when this is a kind of a massively bartering, one thing's exchanged for another network because there's coin shortages. And so Walkden tries to remember how much he owes various people, and he always gets it wrong. And Catherine jumps up and says, Peter, no, remember that she gave us 3 cabbages and we sold her, you know, a pound of butter, and then later they came and helped with our pig. And so this kind of thing goes on all the time. And of course, there's occasional work in the field and gardening. There's animal management. She does lots of errands as well as selling the butter in Preston. There's the famous beekeeping that's distracted me so much with the Oxfordshire Beekeeping Association website. They do gathering activities. She does nursing. Walkden occasionally gets gripes in the middle of the night and needs help. And of course, the children get ill. And she's also involved in spinning and knitting. And one of the things I'm quite interested in is in the later diaries, this becomes much more important to the family, which is interesting. All right, so boiling all this down, we get, in fact, a time allocation study. We get a diary of time use, just like apparently we can't get because of some unknown obstacles. So we can't really, this is the kind of thing that we can use to value the labour that is done by women in this context. And you can see these are rather parsimonious estimates. Occasional tasks I haven't counted at all in the time budget. And seasonal tasks, while they might be occasional, would be quite laborious. So haymaking is a very laborious time for Catherine, for instance. She also goes to chapel with him regularly and helps with the ministry. I haven't counted that. Even on Sundays, of course, Catherine would have to milk, do the childcare, do some of the cooking at least. Some of the time budget might seem strange to modern eyes. Not much time allocated to childcare. This is because children were generally looked after at the same time that other tasks were taking place. One of the key things that Catherine buys is something called greeting strings, which Dobson thought were strings that were supposed to help children walk. But they were much more really like reins to rein children in, so you can actually do something else while you're looking after them. I've assigned what looks like a lot of time to washing, but just remember she does not have any home appliances. This is, hand washing for a family of 5+, and all these regular visitors who keep coming associated with Walden's ministry. Nursing, while again occasional, could be quite onerous. In the diary from 1730, one of the children gets whooping cough and is sick for at least a month. And that must have involved Catherine in a lot of stressful and difficult activity. There's other omissions that are probably incorrect. I haven't suggested that she brews, although I think it's very likely she is brewing small beer. Sanitation, I love sanitation in these sources. We don't hear anything about bringing water into the household, but it probably was a very difficult and laborious task that fell to her. Walkden himself records washing very frequently, and he also records using the midden for fertilizer in the field. So I'm suspicious that is a domestic rubbish heap, where in fact Catherine would probably have to throw the contents of chamber pots and the night soil stuff from the household. All right, what can I say about all this? Well, first of all, the obvious point is the length of Catherine's day. This is 10 hours of work, at least. We also should know the range of tasks that she's doing. And these are not all easy tasks. I wouldn't want to milk that cow that the jolly lady in Home Farm I'm sure it would kick me immediately, for example. The nature of the work is very varied. It involves subsistence production, market production, indirect care, what today we would call housework, and personal care. All these different kinds of tasks that straddle the care diamond, as welfare economists like to call it. So caring labour comes from the shadows, even though such work, which is occasional, is not included here. So now highlighted in red, I've, in a very parsimonious way again, I've actually selected out the time spent on caring labour. And you can see that it amounts to 62% of her labour time. So this is a challenge to the accounts then that say women didn't do caring labour in the past. And this is unpaid caring work. A couple of further comments on uncovering historical caring labour. There are direct references to housework, for instance, and those references again tell us why it is that this kind of work slips out of economic historians' worldview. Walkden very casually says, you have to really be looking really carefully to find these references. He says, oh, Catherine did what was needful in the house. Of course, I pounce on that, but you wouldn't really notice it in all that crabbed writing unless you were being very, very, very careful. He says, oh, she was so full of house business. She couldn't do whatever he wanted it. Oh, family prayers had to be omitted because she was so full of house business. And he says, oh, she was throng, and that, and that's a Northern English word for very, very busy. And we also can see that she has the equipment and the raw materials for housework too. And that this extends what we might think of as housework as well to the tasks that historically were housework. So for instance, they gather rushes to make rush lights, which was a very common activity amongst this kind of household, this kind of echelon in historical societies. And there is some buying of soap to deal with all that laundry that she very laboriously has to do. But we have to also think about how care should be historicized. Yes, this picture is enough to give you the shudders, isn't it? So Catherine advises on medicine. Remember when we first met her, she was getting out of bed to go and advise on medicine. We know she cares for sick children. As I said, one of the children is sick with a serious illness, whooping cough, for a very long period of time. She also deals with Walkden, who, as I said, often gets gripes in the night, usually after he's been at the pub, but I don't think Catherine would raise those issues with him. She bloods friends and neighbours, so she's very good at taking blood, apparently, so she's always cupping people. One in the 1733 to 34 diary, they go on a tour, and when they're in the pub together, a young woman comes up to Catherine and says, oh, could you please take my blood? Because so she's well known in the area then for these kinds of skills. She pulls teeth, both for family and friends. And she visits the old and the sick in the parish and lays out the dead. She delivers babies, as you might expect. And I'm suggesting these activities are very difficult to capture in court records. It's so difficult to be looking straight at women when they're caring. But the really probably most interesting thing is that caring labour is revealed when a substitute is required. So when they have to make payments to neighbours, when Catherine lay in of daughter Catherine, so when she's recovering from childbirth and they have to hire somebody, then it's noted in Walkden's diaries. When you pay for it, it suddenly becomes clear it was work. Or when Walkden himself has to do it, then it's noted in the diaries. So when he says she's gone off to Preston, he says, well, with my love, gone off to Preston, I had to get my children up and dress them. And when, in fact, Catherine was laid up, he talks every day about having to dress his children and give them breakfast and so on. So when an outside specialist is called in the 33 to 34 diary, Walkden's left in charge of the family because Catherine has to go off to bury her mother who has died. And at that point, of course, little Catherine gets injured, wouldn't you expect it? She gets cut on the head. Probably the guiding strings were not enough to keep her under control when Walkden was looking after her. So then he has to go and get her looked after by another woman and this cut on her head treated. So when routines change, then in fact Walkden changes his behaviour and includes caring labour. So he lays down with the little girl to sleep with her when Catherine's away. And when Catherine's services are remunerated, so when she's paid for pulling teeth or blooding people, then he also notices that in his diaries. Okay, now moving along quickly now, because this is drawing now on some published stuff, and it's also getting to the kind of thing that you might easily know about. This is looking at how we might then value this work. And this was based on an old paper by Olli Hall-Rillishen in the Review of Income and Wealth from the 1970s, when he points out that there are several ways in which you can just value unpaid care work in the home, both indirect labour, the domestic labour, the housework, and these caring services. And one is through the opportunity cost approach. So you can just look at the hours devoted to housework weekly, and then the wage costs of individuals who devoting time to housework, and what they could get otherwise. And then there's a market alternative where you just look at the households that don't have domestic labour and multiply by the cost of a housekeeper. And then finally, there's an individual where you break down the household tasks into all their individual myriad dimensions, and you cost them all up according to the specialist wages. This is obviously the best way to do it, but it's much more demanding of the data and very difficult to get at historically. So what I'm going to do today is just very briefly look at the market alternative approach. I hope I've convinced you that Catherine's work was really added up to a housekeeper need. So now we're going to say, well, what would it have cost to have replaced her with a housekeeper? Well, there are upwards and downwards biases here to replacing Catherine with a housekeeper. First of all, there's an upward bias if we're thinking of the whole macroeconomy, because did single people need a whole housekeeper, for example? There's a downward bias, though, too, because housekeepers probably didn't provide all the services that a wife and mother would provide. I'll leave that to your imagination. Particularly when you're calling your housekeeper my love in such a nice way. In Holly Hall-Rillishen's estimates, the housekeeper costs work out as the middle-of-the-road methodology. So this is the kind of middle way of valuing housework. So now we just look at, and these are famous benchmarks in English history of the structure of the society. So this is social structure stuff. And we know from this the number of families, and then we know the families that lack domestic servants. So these are the families and the percentage of all families that are relying on family members to do this work. And then I'm going to use some of my own work here by looking at the annual wage. And this is not of a housekeeper. So again, this is a very parsimonious, a very kind of bottom level estimate, because I'm just using the wages of an unskilled woman worker. And I've added to her wages the cost of her support, because she would in fact live in the household, as Catherine did. And that gives us the costs of a substitute worker. And this then means that we can value what the work that was being done by all these women in households that lack domestic servants at these various points in time. And ladies and gentlemen, this is not trivial. This is really a rather significant total value. So what I'm really suggesting here is that this is 20% of national income is being systematically ignored. And it might well vary over time, which means that we are not measuring changes in incomes correctly. So we are actually missing something, and it's something that we're missing is varying. And, of course, it's very significant to well-being. Okay, conclusions. So what I've done is I've extended the verb-orientated approach into this DOPS approach, and I've applied it to ego documents rather than court records. I'm not suggesting that this should replace the very extensive work that my colleagues have done on court records. This is meant as a, Morgan's here so I can say, nuance. This is meant as a nuance. This is meant as an addition to this kind of verb-orientated approach. And I'm suggesting that when you apply it to these kinds of documents, it's like looking out of the corner of your eye, and therefore you don't have to look at women straight on. You can look at my love out of the corner of your eye and capture her doing her caring labor. The source itself illustrates the disregard for caring and the reasons for this disregard. It's trivialized in the source, both by Walkden himself, and I love the guy. You know, I read his diaries now for about a year. I love him. He's really a nice man. But he trivializes the heavy labor that his wife does. Oh, we paid them to do the milking, the washing, and the rest. I mean, you know, if you were married to him, you'd kick him, wouldn't you? But Dobson just drops the discussions of her milking, which is something she does every day, which takes hours. Caring's noticed in these sources, basically, when men do it or when it's remunerated. So unpaid caring work is generally not noticed. You really have to work hard to uncover it. But its value is very significant relative to total income. So it shouldn't really be ignored in this way. But caution. First of all, this approach to value involves thinking that market wages capture all this work. And we know much of this work has very significant externalities. So breastfeeding, for example, has huge externalities in terms of the health and well-being of the next generation. Something that economic historians are very interested in because it's built into the modern unitary growth theory. So we really should be thinking about what here is improving the productivity, the quality of the next generation. Externalities are very important. If we believe that there's discrimination in the labor market, women's wages are not going to reflect their marginal products. Certainly not going, a servant girl's wages are not going to reflect the productivity of a woman who is as hardworking, as industrious, and as skilled as Catherine Walkden. Is inclusion of care in the market nexus the right strategy to secure appreciation? Does my account really, does it valuing it according to a market wage, does that make you appreciate Catherine Walkden more than my verbal account of everything that she's doing and my descriptive time-use study? Or am I just leaning over to impress the economists here? So is this inclusivist strategy, is this the way to go? Or is this actually just another step to actually see that Catherine's work through this account is being valorized but not valued? Thank you.